Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Caitlin Clarkson Pereira. I am the Executive Director of GVPedia. And again, thank you so much for joining us on today's important Zoom call about gun laws and how they impact safety in our communities and gun violence prevention at large. So just a few housekeeping items before we begin. We are recording this session and we have all our participants on mute. Some of you submitted questions in the RSVP form, which is great, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. If you have other questions that come up during the session, feel free to put them in the chat box for us. And again, we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can as well. So in a moment, I'm going to introduce you to Devin Hughes, who is the founder of GVPedia, but first just want to tell you a little bit about us and who we are as an organization. So GVPedia is a comprehensive resource providing public access to our gun safety database, which is the largest in existence, and it includes over 1,000 academic studies and access to GVP University, which is a repository of white papers and fact sheets about gun violence. Both the database and university are easily searchable by subject matter and provide an excellent resource for educational and advocacy purposes. And GVP University is now also the home of the Facts About Firearm Policy Initiative, which we launched a couple of months ago. So we exist to provide information to elected officials, to staffers, to educators and advocates in a nonpartisan manner in order to make sure that legislation which is being written and voted on is done so based on the facts. So now I'm going to turn it over to Devin, and we are both going to lead a conversation on gun laws. Hi, Devin.
Hello, thank you so much. I'm gonna go ahead and make sure my screen share works.
Perfect.
Damn.
Perfect. All right. So Devin, can you kick us off by just giving us some insight into the pro-gun arguments against gun laws? That's something that we hear often, right? Like some things like gun laws don't work. What specifically are these arguments and where do they come from?
Right. So today's topic, I want to touch on a few things. First, the pro-gun arguments around, and we often hear these talking points, either gun laws don't work or criminals don't follow laws. And there's a whole multitude of these phrases out there and examples. Some of the most prominent examples that we see, though, are the case of Chicago, which is often held up as like a one-word refutation of everything on our side. And so that'll be one of the points that we get into. Also, there's a very popular claim out there that every time guns are banned, we see murder rates increase. Another one of these is that the background check system is incredibly broken and is preventing people from accessing firearms who should be able to, and that the system's just full of errors that from the pro-gun side. And then there's another pro-gun talking point I want to go into, and that's the idea that all we need to do is just enforce the laws we already have. And this is an incredibly popular talking point, even outside of the direct gun debate. Oftentimes people who aren't as familiar with this issue will be, well, why don't we just enforce the licensing laws that we already have without recognizing that we don't have nationwide licensing laws? And then I'll wrap up with, before opening it up to questions, with some of the laws that do work and why laws actually work. So that's a bit of the framework that I want to go into today.
So I'm glad that you brought up Chicago, because that seems to be the place that folks in the pro-gun world hyper-focus on as proof for the claim that gun laws don't work. So why is this theory mistaken, and how is it possible for us to refute it?
Right. So Chicago in particular is held up as the gun laws don't work and kind of the poster child for it. Every time you say gun laws might work, well, what about Chicago? And it's even in meme format all over the place, with often claims that it's the #1 in gun control, but number one in terms of murder and gang violence, or whatever sort of violence they want to add on. And part of the problem with this is none of this is actually true. So Chicago is not number one in terms of gun control laws. It relies on the state of Illinois for most of its gun laws, and it has the unfortunate problem of having bad neighbors, which we'll get to in just a moment. But states such as Hawaii and Massachusetts have stronger laws than Illinois, but they aren't held up. And the reason Chicago tends to be held up as an example of gun laws not working is that the absolute number of people being killed and injured there is extremely high. However, when we look at it compared to other cities and control for population, while Chicago certainly does have a major problem that needs to be worked on and addressed with a multitude of solutions, it's not that much of an outlier relative to cities such as St. Louis, Baltimore, New Orleans, and cities that aren't brought up nearly as much, such as like Cleveland, Kansas City, Memphis, which happen to be in states that are Republican controlled. And so there are substantial gun murder problems in all of these cities that need to be addressed, but Chicago's not an outlier. It's not the worst case there. And part of the problem that Chicago is as bad as it is because it borders Indiana. Basically, you can hop in a car and 30 minutes to an hour later, be in Indiana and buy as many guns as possible with very few regulations. And when you look at a background of where the crime guns that are found in Chicago are collected from, about 40% are from Illinois itself. Another 20% are from Indiana. And then you have another 20% from a collection of states such as Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama, and a bunch of southern states that are exporting their guns into the Chicago area. And that's the main problem with Chicago, is that it's not an island. It can't block all these guns coming from states that have weaker laws. And so that really cripples their response to the epidemic of gun violence. And that's, so basically Chicago's not an example of gun laws not working. It's a perfect example of weak gun laws allowing people who shouldn't have access to firearms to have easy access to those firearms, and bad results happen.
Thank you. So in addition to the typical quote unquote gun laws don't work, we often see commentary about banned guns and the places where they're banned, whether that means all guns or maybe more specifically handguns. But people say that places where guns are banned, that the murder rates increase. So if gun regulations work, then why is this a talking point? And what can we do to refute this?
So quite often when you mention that, like, well, Chicago's not an island, one of the common talking points on top of that is like, well, places that are islands have banned guns and their murder rates go up. And this myth comes from, well, it's been around for a while, but it's shown up most prominently in a circuit court case in a declaration of support by John Lott. And he says, every place has banned guns, every place, and either all guns or all handguns, has seen murder rates go up. Examples include Chicago, which we just addressed, Illinois, which doesn't ban guns, Washington, D.C., and island nations such as England, Jamaica, Ireland, Venezuela, which is not an island, in case you're wondering, and obscure places like the Solomon Islands. So this is a pretty strong statement, and if it were correct, it'd be like, wow, I guess like there are problems with this. However, this analysis ignores one of the biggest island nations in the world, Japan, which passed a series of gun laws in the late 1940s and 1950s that gradually banned all guns. And Japan has some of, if not the strongest gun laws in the world. And Japan enforces those laws. And while Japan's murder rate has been low relative to the US for over this entire time period, as this chart shows with the blue line, it's fallen more than 75% over the past 5 decades. So, and this is overall homicides. If you were to just narrow it to gun homicides, Japan's only has single-digit numbers of murders. Not just the rate, but the overall number of gun murders is in the single digits. So Japan has been incredibly successful with reducing homicides overall and gun homicides through strong gun laws. And just to go briefly through the other examples that are brought up, and keep in mind, this is in a circuit court case that is seeking to basically judge whether California's assault weapon ban is held up. And so like with England, you might wonder, well, I haven't heard of England having skyrocketing murder rates. Well, that's because it really hasn't. There was a period of time where murder rates did increase in the early 2000s, but that was due to them finding a serial killer and putting all those murders into basically 1 year. And you had a couple of terrorist attacks that had nothing to do with gun laws. And so England's homicide rate spiked upwards after that, but it had nothing to do with the gun laws in place. And after that spike, we've seen gun homicides and overall homicides substantially decrease in England. So that's clearly not true. Jamaica during, I believe it's the 1970s that's referenced here, saw its homicide increase, but that's because it had a political civil war where there were two parties actively battling each other on the streets and had nothing to do with, again, with the gun laws on that. Ireland had the troubles in the 80s, 90s, and into the early 2000s, where you had political violence, and which again had nothing to do with gun laws. Venezuela, aside from not being an island, while it technically bans some guns, none of those laws are actually enforced on the ground. And so you see still a massive amount of violence, but the laws that have been passed aren't being enforced at all. So nothing's really changed on the ground there. And then with the obscure place of the Solomon Islands, they again had a civil war right after gun laws were passed, although it had nothing to do with those gun laws. Peacekeepers went in and reestablished order. And they decided, once they reestablished order, that, yeah, we should get these guns out of the hands of people on the street to make things safer. And so when they actually enforced the laws there, gun homicides dramatically decreased, even according to John Lott's own data that he's citing here. So in essence, this talking point is not just false, it's completely false. And it's unfortunate that it's there because it could help sway a court case, which is kind of scary.
All right, so now that we've talked about how when guns are banned, that doesn't directly correlate with an increase in murder, there are other myths, particularly around background checks and how those background checks are often incorrect, and therefore having background checks to begin with is irrelevant. So can you tell us some more about that theory?
Right. And so there's two parts to the idea that background checks are unreliable or just not working. And the first part is the idea that people who should be able to pass a background check aren't doing so because of mistakes within the system. And there's this idea that 99% of all the background check denials are mistakes. And this is important because the Department of Justice was actually looking into this matter, and you have congressmen citing this number as evidence that, like, hey, we really need to look into the system and basically waste resources in an investigation. And so this has been coming up more and more frequently. And unfortunately, there are signs that some Democratic lawmakers who aren't necessarily fully aware of what the talking point is and where it comes from and why it's false are buying into it and thinking like, hey, we should investigate this. The problem here with the 99% of the denials are mistakes is that it's the exact opposite of true. In fact, the FBI and the Office of Inspector General have investigated the background check system to see, is it working? And they found that 99.8% of background check denials, meaning they're stopping somebody from purchasing a gun, are accurate. And this lined up with the FBI's own internal estimates that the accuracy rate is 99.3% and to 99.8% accurate. This means that the sort of mistakes being alleged here just aren't happening on a substantial scale. Now, where there is a kernel of truth in terms of background checks being unreliable is on the flip side, letting people who shouldn't have firearms be able to purchase them. The most famous example of this is the Charleston loophole, otherwise known as the default proceed loophole, where after 3 days, if a gun store is unable, or the FBI is unable to complete a background check, the sale of the gun's allowed to go through. And quite frequently, they discover after the fact that, whoops, this person should not have been allowed to get a firearm. And fortunately, most of the time, they're able to contact the person and reclaim the firearms. But there's plenty of people slipping through the cracks there. Another problem is that states are notoriously bad at submitting records to the national database, particularly around mental health records. And so people who should not be able to purchase firearms just aren't showing up in the background check system. And so it is the case that the background check system does have loopholes and errors in it, but it's on the other side of the equation. And those loopholes definitely do need to be patched up. And to lead on slightly to the next section, it's one area where laws do need to be enforced and patched up in order to work.
As you mentioned in the first slide, sometimes gun advocates just come out and say, since we already have laws on the books, we just need to enforce the laws that we currently have. Can you tell us more about this talking point and why it's maybe more complicated than it appears at face value?
Right. So just enforce the laws does have a kernel of truth to it. We have a massive patchwork of laws in the United States, many of which aren't being properly enforced. And so there's substantial room for improvement here. So that part's correct. However, what's left out of this is why our laws got this way. And it's been a decades-long campaign by the gun lobby to basically turn our laws into the equivalent of Swiss cheese. I want to provide 2 examples to show kind of the major holes here and stuff that, if filled, could substantially reduce gun violence. So the first is the case of Badger Guns and Ammo, which was a gun store in the Milwaukee area in the 1990s to early 2000s. Before the Ty-Hart Amendment was passed, which I'll get to in a moment, in 1999, the ATF investigated this gun store, and with the threat of various lawsuits and cracking down on measures, Badger Guns agreed to change its policies, and it decided to eliminate the sale of low-quality, inexpensive handguns that were ending up on the street. And this single, rather simple-looking change from the gun store had profound impacts. There was a 73% decrease in crime guns sold by the dealer. And overall, for the entire city of Milwaukee, there's a 44% reduction in the flow of crime guns in the city, meaning just this one change to a gun store policy had a profound impact, and it showed the effectiveness of the ATF combined with threats of legal action in changing behavior. However, the pro-gun lobby in Congress was not happy with this. And so in 2003, they passed the Ty-Hart Amendments, which did a number of things. For example, it forced the FBI to destroy background check records that were passed within 24 hours, basically meaning that the FBI was forced to destroy potential evidence. Another thing it did, along with the PLCAA, which came a couple years later, was broadly shield gun stores from legal repercussions for guns ending up in the wrong hands. And after the Tie-Hart amendments were passed, Badger decided to reverse course and start selling low quality, inexpensive handguns again. And in the years following, there was an immediate 203% spike upwards in guns diverted to criminals from the store. So basically all the progress that the ATF had made was reversed by this amendment because they can no longer go after the gun store and make sure that it was acting in a responsible fashion. And so this is a deliberate hole in our gun laws that was created. Another example relating to the ATF is the state of Arkansas more recently in 2014 to 2015. It's important to note that the ATF has been severely underfunded and just under constant siege for the past several decades, and therefore has very limited manpower and resources to actually do what the agency is supposed to do. And as a result, only around 7% of gun stores in the country are audited on an annual basis, which means 93% aren't. And so you can go years and maybe even like a decade in between audits by the ATF. And those audits are just making sure that, hey, you have the proper paperwork and you aren't illegally selling guns and stuff like that. And because of this, the number of guns that are reported lost or stolen from gun stores is very low. And in 2014, in fact, there's only 317 reported lost or stolen firearms in the entire state of Arkansas. However, the ATF received a tip about a gun store in Arkansas that might have been engaged in some shady business practices. So they launched an investigation in 2015. And then, so for the entire state of Arkansas, in 2015, there's 2,951 lost or stolen firearms, up from 317. And 98% of those 2,900 lost or stolen firearms were from that single store that the ATF decided to investigate based on a tip. And for comparison, Texas, which is a much larger state than Arkansas, only reported 1,000 guns lost or stolen, despite having 5 times the number of dealers as Arkansas. So what this shows is that imagine if the ATF actually had the resources to audit 25% or 50% of gun stores on an annual basis, and were able to audit gun stores once every 2 to 3 to 4 years on a fairly regular basis. You would be catching far more bad actors like this one in Arkansas and potentially be able to do something, even though the ATF is still limited from Tie-Hart amendments. It could still potentially do something, but it just doesn't have the resources to enforce the laws on the books already. And so, yes, we do need to enforce laws, but we've been prevented from doing so by a coordinated campaign over the past couple of decades. And this also ties back into the idea that criminals don't follow laws, which is a heavily simplistic talking point. To base off that, it's not that criminals don't follow laws, it's that they aren't dissuaded by weak laws. If there's no enforcement, there's no incentive to change behavior, and dangerous behavior such as obtaining firearms is going to continue. And part of the one of the major problems in the US is that our patchwork of laws overall is quite weak. And so it definitely does need to be strengthened in addition to enforcing the laws already there.
So if some of the laws that we have on the books currently have been undermined or under enforced, or there are forces working against them, what laws do work?
So the evidence overall shows that strong gun laws save lives. So I'm going to go into looking at the overall picture, the overall strength of gun laws, and then some specific laws. So for the laws that, laws overall do make a difference, despite what the pro-gun talking points were indicate. This chart's from Giffords from this year. I have Oklahoma highlighted because that's the state I'm from. And we see that states with stronger laws rated A have substantially lower gun deaths than states rated D or F or even C. There's a clear correlation here that the stronger laws you have reduce gun violence. And so what are some examples of that? And from here, I'm looking at the top 5 states, and then I'm going to pull up Oklahoma as a comparison. So there's permit to purchase, which is an incredibly strong law. Most of the states with the lowest gun deaths have this. Do they have universal background checks? Yes. Handguns registered or reported, only a couple of them have it. None of them have stand your ground laws, and all of them make it difficult to obtain a concealed carry permit. Now let's look at Oklahoma. Permit to purchase required? No. Universal background checks? No. Handguns registered or reported? Please. Stand your ground? Obviously we have that. Obtaining a concealed carry permit? Easy. And in fact, since this chart was created, it's gotten even easier as permitless carry has passed in Oklahoma. And in terms of gun deaths, like for Hawaii, there's 2.5 per 100,000. In Oklahoma, there's 16.4 per 100,000. And it's actually gotten worse. And so in terms of the laws that actually reduce violence, and I'm going to go through this relatively quickly to make sure we open it up to questions. Discretionary permit to purchase is by far the strongest and is actually potentially somewhat under threat with the recent Supreme Court case, which we can get into. Gun removal for domestic violence convictions and protective orders are incredibly important for reducing domestic violence. Alongside that, you have extreme risk protection orders, which are very promising in reducing not only domestic violence, but stuff like mass shootings and suicides. Part of the problem with extreme risk protection orders, and this was actually a question that came in, is like, how best do we make sure that, what are the barriers to extreme risk protection orders being enforced, and why aren't people hearing about it? And one of the problems is that oftentimes the laws pass and then there's no real thought or follow through to how are we going to make sure people are aware that there's this new tool out there that can be used. And so often in some of the states, if there's not some sort of campaign around it to raise awareness, it's just not used because people aren't aware of it. And so there needs to be funding to make sure that people are aware of the law, and also that law enforcement and judges know how to enforce the law and make sure it's done in a way to keep everybody safe while also making sure that rights are preserved. And so that's one area where laws need to be enforced and follow through needs to happen. Another thing that can really help are audits of gun dealers, making sure that the case of Arkansas doesn't continue to happen. Child access prevention laws with strong penalties if guns are stored outside a gun safe are incredibly important. Community-led programs, both like measures such as cure violence, but also hospital intervention programs are extremely important to reducing violence. And overall, we need a comprehensive package of gun laws to reduce gun violence. Each of the measures above are very important and critical at reducing one aspect of gun violence, but we need the entire package in order to have a lasting and profound change. And that's why GVPedia created or helped draft the Denver Accord and compiled it as a roadmap to reducing gun violence. And it has all of these policies and more in there to make sure we're addressing each and every aspect of gun violence, because the only way we're going to solve this epidemic is to have a comprehensive solution.
So you mentioned it briefly, but the Supreme Court case that's going to be heard in October, why does the myth that gun laws don't work matter overall, and more specifically in relation to that case?
Right. So the problem here with the Supreme Court case is that from a statistical perspective, if the justices are persuaded or at least have enough doubt about the efficacy of gun laws, they're almost certainly going to rule something like New York's permitting process, which requires somebody to demonstrate a need to obtain a permit, to be unconstitutional, because if it doesn't work, then why do you have it there? And so if enough doubt can be created with myths and the idea that no gun laws work or even increase crime, then the justices are far more likely to side with the pro-gun side of the argument. And that could be incredibly dangerous, particularly if the Supreme Court decides to make a broad ruling and say stuff like may issue permit to purchase or permit to purchase overall is unconstitutional. Then we start facing major problems because one of the most effective measures to combat gun violence is may issue or discretionary permit to purchase laws. If that's declared unconstitutional, one of our best tools at reducing gun violence is out the window, and it's going to be substantially more difficult. And so there's a direct path from myths and those myths gaining weight to preventing laws that could save lives. And it's incredibly troubling and concerning.
Okay, thank you for all those slides and that information. So we're going to open it up to questions now. As I said before, I have a couple from the RSVP form, so I'm going to start off with those. And then if anyone in the audience has other questions that you think of, just feel free to put them in the chat box for us. So you touched on it a little bit before, but one of the questions we received, and I know that this is something that some states are working on currently, what are the obstacles to creating public awareness of red flag laws? Excuse me.
Right. So I think probably the biggest obstacle is that people aren't familiar with gun laws in general. Like if you ask people on the street, it's like, well, should we have more gun laws or less gun laws? And they're like, oh, I'm just fine with our current licensing system. And they might be in a state, I'll pick on my own state of Oklahoma. It's like, well, we don't have a licensing system for firearms. We don't have a centralized database when a gun crime is committed that you can submit the gun to, and nationally it'll pull up who bought it and where you can find them. Like, while that's popular in crime TV shows, like that's not how our system is set up. And so there's a lot of misinformation about the current laws as they are. And that misinformation or lack of awareness extends to extreme risk protection orders. If people aren't aware that the state has an extreme risk protection order, they're not going to utilize it. And that's incredibly problematic because it's a quite effective tool. And if people were aware of it, they would be able to use it and then save lives with it. Another problem is with enforcement. And I forget where the case was. I think in Indiana, the shooter was actually has guns taken in an extreme risk protection order hearing, and he never got those guns back. However, he just went and bought more guns because his information wasn't put into the system. And so while the extreme risk protection order worked at first, it failed in the end because it wasn't enforced. And so even if people are aware, you still need to have that enforcement as well. And so for law enforcement and judges to be familiar with it and make sure that they're putting the correct information into the proper databases. And so there's that whole host of problems. Now, those problems can be overcome, and there's other states that have made extreme risk protection orders very successful. And you see situations, I forget which state, it might have been California, where the FBI used an extreme risk protection order to stop somebody who was planning on a mass shooting. And so it has been used in direct cases and has been remarkably successful. And so, like, there's the definite obstacles that I mentioned, but there's ways around it as well. I'm going to stop sharing my screen right here for the questions.
Thank you. So which state laws would you say are most prevalent around the country? And that's a pretty general question. So if you want to harp on the stronger laws or the the good laws or the bad laws, or you feel
Right.
makes no sense.
So the most prevalent laws out there are unfortunately on the bad side. So permitless carry has exploded in recent years to where we're nearing or have already achieved a majority of states having permitless carry. And that's just in the past 5 to 10 years. Before that, laws had been weakened to right to carry laws, and now they're being weakened even more. So the overwhelming majority of states have either right to carry or permitless carry now, both of which have been found to increase crime. Another popular law trend are stand your ground laws that we're seeing enacted across the country. And one of the most recent cases was Ohio, in which the governor was initially going to veto the law, but was swayed by bad data afterwards and directly cited bad data or like an actual myth when making his case for why he then allowed stand your ground laws to pass. And so with those laws, again, we're seeing the impact of myths. And the overall trends at the state level are not going well, even though we thankfully have somebody who takes gun violence prevention seriously in the White House, and we have the narrowest of majorities in the Senate and House. Also, I'm noticing in chat that Indiana did not utilize their red flag law in that particular case, so I was mistaken on that. So my apologies for that.
That's something that we've spoken about, this idea. Sometimes when you hear gun laws, you assume that they're in place to make us safer, but that we can't automatically, that's not necessarily why a lot of them are in place, right? So permitless carry, stand your ground, those things work against us and the work and the safety that we're trying to bring to our communities. So just because people might say like, well, our states have a lot of gun laws, doesn't necessarily mean that that's a good thing that's going to protect us more.
Yeah. And I'm also seeing a question in chat about like, because Texas has been one of the states that has been going down this bad path recently. Do we have data on the increase in gun deaths since 2018? And so we do have gun violence archive data. So if you go to gunviolencearchive.org and use their congressional district filter, you can set it for the entire state and be able to see gun deaths outside of suicides from 2014 to, well, present, so partway through 2021. The CDC data is not quite there yet because there's slightly more than a year lag on that. So if you're going to try to use CDC data to make the point, it would take a bit longer. You'd have to wait another year or two to be able to show the impact. So I'd recommend using gun violence archive data, even though you're not going to get suicides there.
So we have a question that says, what can we do to help get better information into our leaders' hands? So how can we combat bad info or myths?
It's tough. And in our previous conversation, like where in our GVPedia Explores conversation with Evan, we kind of talked about the potential for a backlash problem, where if you present somebody with just facts and try to go right at people and debunk all the myths right there, it can cause a backlash to that and cause people to be entrenched in their beliefs. So basically, somebody has to see you already as a trusted source of information and for that information to be useful to them personally. And so slowly over time, building inroads for people and changing their minds and then basically turning them into advocates as well. It's a long process that requires in-person contact. Like it's not likely to happen over the internet. Like very few productive conversations occur in Facebook chat. But there's that. And then for lawmakers themselves, at least from my experience, like they can't be experts on everything. And that's being slightly generous as well. So they're just going to see what information is handed to them, or they're going to tell a congressional intern, like, hey, go find me data on this so I can then make a speech on the House floor about it, or something to that effect. And so making sure that they have the accurate data can have a substantial impact. And so that way, if they're still going to decide in a counterproductive fashion, at least they aren't going to be able to hold it up with improper data. They're going to have to use something else to justify their position. And so just making sure the data is readily available is an important part, and not assuming that they're going to have access to the best available data. And also making sure that when you're presenting the data yourself, that it is accurate and peer reviewed, and make sure it's the strongest data possible. Because if it turns out some information you provide is false, that's going to set you back quite substantially. We're kind of facing an asymmetric war here, where the pro-gun side is able to make up stuff left, right, and center, and do it consistently. Whereas if we make a single mistake, it's going to haunt us for the rest of our days. And it's unfortunate, but it's just the position we're in. And so making sure we hold ourselves to a higher standard, even though it's not fair, it's just going to be essential going forward.
There's a note in the chat saying Chicago launched a suit yesterday against an Indiana gun store that has been found to be a major supplier of crime guns in Chicago.
Interesting. I'm not as familiar with that case. I was getting caught up with the Supreme Court bombshell yesterday. Do you know how they plan to get around FLACA to Jim McGrath and chat? Because that's another problem there.
I don't know much about it other than it was just announced. That's all I know. I don't know any details. So just a kind of a heads up.
Perfect. Thank you for the heads up. And it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, we'll look into that more. Thank you, Jim. We have a question for red flag laws. When and under what conditions are guns returned to a person?
So after the threat is passed, you can have another hearing, and it might vary by state. Here, I'm not entirely certain how much it varies by state, but the general gist is that you can have another hearing and petition to, hey, like the crisis has passed, I'm no longer suicidal or a threat, and to reobtain your guns in that fashion. And so there's definitely ways to reobtain, and I believe it has happened in the past in the states that have them. Part of the problem, though, is that it can be unclear in some states whether like the red flag record actually goes into a database to prevent somebody from just going out and buying guns legally. Now they can also just go through a private sale as well. So there's still that avenue as well. So for extreme risk protection orders to be the most effective, you're also going to have to close the private sales loophole at some point as well, to make sure that avenue for reacquiring guns when the person is still a threat to themselves or others is there.
Can you talk about Mexico and the presumed myth that comes from Mexico and gun trafficking with the country to our south?
Yeah, so one of the critical aspects that's often overlooked with conversations about gun laws is that we just put it in the context of within the United States. And it's often ignored how much our weak gun laws hurt our neighbors, and particularly Mexico. There's a myth out there that most of Mexican crime guns come from elsewhere, places other than the United States, and only around like 14% actually come from the US. And that's actually a myth. There's been multiple studies on this, and with the ATF helping out Mexico and tracing where the guns came from. And at least 70% of the firearms in Mexico have a US origin that are recovered at crime scenes. And the reason is it's extremely easy to obtain firearms in the US. You can get straw purchases and then ship the guns south. And it's having a devastating impact on Mexico, which Mexico itself has strict gun laws, but when you have basically a beacon of guns in the form of the US, there's not as much that they can do about it. And it's dramatically increased the deadliness of the drug war that's occurring both there and here at home. And so that's another way in which our gun laws not being enforced or having weak gun laws is having a deadly impact. And just real quick, I noticed in chat as the correction that in Indiana, the prosecutors have to make the case before a judge within 14 days. They determined that was not enough time to make the case and had taken his gun, so assumed the problem was solved. Okay, so there's the process, but it was never completed. Thank you for those clarifications.
Is there anyone who holds law enforcement accountable for not enforcing red flag laws and temporary protective orders, especially those that result in death or injury to the recipient of the order or protection?
Not to my knowledge, because I mean, overwhelmingly, it's just something gets lost in the paperwork. And I mean, there's been cases, I believe it's with domestic violence restraining orders, both that and just in general making, in Maryland, there's this case study in a certain court that looked at cases where or somebody who had been convicted of a crime was supposed to have relinquished their firearms. And in the overwhelming majority of those cases, the judge never mentioned to the person who had been convicted of the crime that, hey, you need to give up your firearms. And when it was mentioned, there was no follow-up. So it's basically like an honor system. Like even when it was mentioned, it's like, oh yeah, just turn in your guns here. No, we're not going to check if you actually did, or whether you have any guns from out of state. And so like even there, it's like an honor system for dangerous people. And it's like, so there's not even to the point where it could be enforced or people could be held accountable because it's not even brought up there. And so there's those sort of systemic problems that need to be addressed, and before law enforcement and others are held accountable. And it's just overwhelming, and not in law enforcement and the judges in general just aren't informed. Because I feel like if they were informed about the power of tools such as extremist protection orders, they would realize, wow, these are actually quite effective and we can use them to keep people safer. But in many cases, it hasn't been, unfortunately.
Do you think some of it also has to do with confusion, maybe, right? Like we talk about what's happening at the national level for national laws, and then states have their own laws, and some of it's covered heavily in the media. Some of it's not covered at all. And so that, like you said, it's just almost impossible for everyone to be informed unless they're really diligent about it and on top of it.
Yeah, it's just bad all around.
Yeah. There's a question. Can you give details about hospital intervention programs that Devin mentioned earlier?
Yes. So some of the most promising ones that, so there's a couple forms. One is on the firearm injury side of it, where if somebody comes into a hospital and has a gunshot wound, police are notified but also like social workers and others who might be able to help that person, because people who have already been victimized by gun violence are at a higher risk of being victimized again. And so making sure people are aware and like, hey, what can we do to help? What resources can we provide to this person who comes in with a gunshot injury, and getting them out of a potential life of crime and tit for tat sort of retaliation, and trying to break the cycle of violence when it appears there. So that's one form that shows promising results. Another form, and I haven't seen this duplicated elsewhere, I believe it was the Henry Ford Health System, developed a program for people at higher risk of suicide. And this program involved a lot of counseling and making sure that people had proper resources. But one of the key elements to this program was making sure that people who express suicidal ideation did not have lethal means readily available, and that included firearms. And so and this was, I believe, for around 200,000 patients. And for that population, there should have been 50 plus deaths before the intervention. If it had just been a standard group of people, you would expect around 20 or so deaths. This program was so effective that it reduced the number of deaths for a couple years to 0. So for a period of a couple years, it was almost 100% effective. And one of the cornerstones of that program was making sure that people who were suicidal did not have ready access to firearms. And because many of the people just didn't think about it. In fact, when you look at our medical system overall, there's been surveys of nurses, and a startling low percentage, like way less than half, think that having a firearm in the home increases the risk of death, and particularly around suicide as well. So people in the medical system just aren't as informed on this. And when they're informed and put into a solid program like the Henry Ford Health System did, it can have profound life-saving impacts. And I'm actually kind of surprised it hasn't been attempted to be duplicated, at least to my knowledge, since then, but it's an incredibly promising path forward.
So we have 2 comments here about Texas. The one is empathizing with what you said before about there not being follow-up for red flags or for situations where folks should not be in possession of their guns anymore. So Christina says this is a huge problem in Texas, especially with domestic violence. Even when it is mentioned by the judge, as I've witnessed in Galveston County, there's no follow-up, and has been stated that there's nothing further that can be done for these victims that are living with the threat of another attack. Hopefully we can gather data and attempt legislation for more protection, for sure. And very discouraged right now that Texas is close to passing permitless carry. Individuals on the advisory board for Texas Gun Sense, and we have announced to the people that the Texas Police Association, as well as a large group of faith leaders, have pleaded with the public to not pass this dangerous law. We've been calling and emailing our legislators, but the gun lobby is so strong. Any suggestions? Here in Texas, you'd think they respect law enforcement and faith leaders, but they're turning their heads to them.
So one potential path, and I'm not sure about how Texas does ballot initiatives. I know in some states it's actually not an option, but in Oklahoma, we've tried, or various organizations have tried, and we were stopped due to COVID, but doing ballot initiatives to repeal permitless carry, because we know from polling data that these sort of laws are incredibly unpopular, and even among Republicans. And so they're part of the problem, from what I've witnessed, is that like lawmakers in general are more scared of the NRA giving them an F rating than like people being mildly dissatisfied that some new bad gun law has been passed. And so they just keep going about and passing laws such as permitless carry, which if it weren't for that threat, political threat, they would never pass. Like, they recognize that it's insane. And so I feel, while ballot initiatives are incredibly expensive, like being able to show that people in general are not on board with these sort of laws can potentially have a profound impact, particularly with the changing demographics in Texas, to where the population of Texas is very close to purple, even though the legislature is still pretty red. Like, if you can show that and basically pick, like, here's the most unpopular law, and then strike it down with a ballot initiative, I would think that could have a substantial impact. Now, like, from other states that have attempted similar ballot type initiatives, is horribly expensive. And I would imagine in Texas, like, everything's bigger in Texas, aside from the football teams, go OU, that it's going to be far more expensive to do such a thing if you're able to. But with legislators as they are, that might be the only path. So it's an unfortunate situation, but that would be my general thoughts on that.
And Johanna, as you're experiencing that in Texas, if you have questions or thoughts that you want to bounce off someone, feel free to reach out to me and Devin, and we can try to help you navigate that to the best of our ability, from Oklahoma and from Connecticut. So, all right, well, that was great timing. We want to let everybody go. We're going to be respectful of your time, so we're going to wrap up now. But thank you again for joining us. Again, the session was recorded, so we will send it out to everyone, and you can share it as you see fit with colleagues, with other people involved in the movement. And we're going to keep doing these sessions, so just keep watching out on social media and in your email, and we'll keep sending you invitations for future GVPedia Explains sessions. All right. Any final thoughts, Devin?
Just thank you so much. And if you want to see more information on any of these topics, particularly on laws, we have it on GVPedia itself, as well as denveraccord.org for more information. And we do have a fact sheet on community-based programs as well that includes the hospital interventions. So if you're interested, you can go to GVP University and find that there. It's part 8 of the Denver Accord.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Devin. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll see you all soon.